A doctor, judging a woman by her humble appearance, brusquely turns her away from his private clinic, assuming she can't afford his services. Weeks later, he learns his mistake when she makes a staggering donation to a rival hospital, all while announcing she's the heiress to a vast fortune. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Dr. Michael Thompson adjusted his silk tie as he walked through the marble-floored lobby of Thompson Medical Center, the most exclusive private practice in downtown Chicago. At 42, he had built an empire of wealth and prestige that his colleagues both envied and admired. The sleek glass building bore his name in gold lettering, a testament to 15 years of relentless ambition and careful cultivation of only the most affluent clientele. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows as Michael reviewed his appointment schedule on his tablet. Senator Williams at 9 for his annual executive physical, Mrs. Rothschild at 10:30 for cosmetic consultations, and tech mogul David Chen at noon for his quarterly health optimization session. Each appointment represented not just medical care but substantial revenue that funded his lavish lifestyle. Dr. Thompson called his receptionist, Jessica Martinez, from behind the polished mahogany reception desk. "Your 9 o'clock is here early, and there's also—" She hesitated, glancing toward the waiting area. "There's an elderly woman who doesn't have an appointment. She says it's urgent." Michael barely looked up from his tablet. "You know the policy, Jessica. No appointment, no exceptions. We're not a charity clinic. Direct her to the county hospital if it's truly urgent." His voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. The waiting area was a showcase of understated luxury, Italian leather chairs arranged around glass coffee tables laden with architectural magazines and bottles of imported mineral water. The walls displayed Michael's numerous awards and photographs of him with various celebrities and politicians he'd treated over the years. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of refined exclusivity. Senator Williams emerged from the elevator, his silver hair perfectly styled and his handmade suit impeccable despite the early hour. "Michael, my boy," he boomed, extending a manicured hand. "Ready for another clean bill of health, I trust?" "Of course, Senator. Right this way." Michael guided his patient toward the executive examination suite, designed more like a luxury hotel room than a medical facility. As they walked, he caught a glimpse of the elderly woman Jessica had mentioned. She sat hunched in one of the leather chairs, her weathered hands clutching a worn purse. Her simple cotton dress and scuffed shoes stood in stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Something about her reminded him fleetingly of his grandmother, but he quickly pushed the thought aside. Business was business, and sentiment had no place in success. The examination of Senator Williams proceeded with the efficiency and attention Michael was renowned for. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment hummed quietly as he conducted thorough tests discussing the senator's golf game and upcoming legislation between procedures. The politician's health was excellent, as expected from someone who could afford the finest preventive care money could buy. "Remarkable as always, Michael," Senator Williams said as he buttoned his shirt. "Your grandfather would be proud of how far you've come. I remember when he used to make house calls to anyone who needed help, regardless of their ability to pay." Michael's jaw tightened slightly. His grandfather had been a beloved family doctor in a small Illinois town, treating farmers and factory workers with equal dedication. But that kind of practice had left him with little more than the community's gratitude and a modest house. Michael had learned early that good intentions didn't pay for medical school or build medical empires. Times have changed, Senator. Modern medicine requires significant investment in technology and expertise. We provide the highest quality care to those who value it enough to pay for it. After seeing Senator Williams out, Michael prepared for his next appointment. Through his office window, he noticed the elderly woman still sitting in the waiting area. She had been there for over an hour now, and something about her patient stillness nagged at him. He buzzed Jessica. "Is that woman still here?" "Yes, doctor. I've told her 3 times that you don't see walk-ins, but she insists on waiting. She says her name is Margaret Johnson, and that it's very important she speak with you. Should I call security?" Michael considered this. Margaret Johnson was a common enough name, and she looked harmless enough. Still, he had built his reputation on maintaining strict boundaries. Give her 5 more minutes, then yes, call security if necessary. I won't have vagrants disrupting our atmosphere. Mrs. Rothschild's appointment went smoothly. A routine consultation about minor cosmetic procedures that would cost more than most people earned in a month. As she left, promising to schedule the procedures through her personal assistant, Michael felt the familiar satisfaction of another substantial fee secured. It was nearly lunchtime when Jessica appeared at his office door looking uncomfortable. "Dr. Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mrs. Johnson is still here. She's been sitting there for almost 3 hours now. She's not causing any trouble, but she seems to be having some difficulty breathing." Michael's first instinct was irritation. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd structured his practice to avoid. "I thought I made it clear that she needed to go to County General." "I suggested that, sir, but she said she specifically needs to see you. She mentioned something about your grandfather." This stopped Michael cold. Very few people even knew about his grandfather anymore, and those who did were certainly not elderly women sitting uninvited in his waiting room. Curiosity finally overcame his rigid policies. "Fine. Give me 2 minutes, then bring her to examination room 3. But make it clear this is a one-time exception, and I'm not accepting any form of charity case as a patient." Margaret Johnson moved slowly as Jessica helped her into the examination room. Up close, Michael could see she was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and kind blue eyes that seemed oddly familiar. Her breathing was indeed labored, and he noticed a slight bluish tint to her lips that immediately put him on medical alert. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand you wanted to see me specifically. I have very limited time, so please tell me what this is about." Her voice was soft but clear with the slight tremor of age. "Dr. Thompson, I knew your grandfather, Dr. Robert Thompson. He delivered me 68 years ago, and he took care of my family for most of his career. I heard you had become a successful doctor, and I was hoping you might have inherited some of his compassion along with his medical skills." Michael felt an unexpected twinge at the mention of his grandfather, but his professional demeanor remained intact. "My grandfather practiced in a different era, Mrs. Johnson. Modern medicine requires different approaches. Now, if you're experiencing a medical emergency, I really must insist you go to the emergency room at County General, where they're equipped to handle walk-in cases." Margaret studied his face for a long moment, and Michael had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing right through his carefully constructed persona. "I can pay," she said quietly. "I know your fees are substantial, but I can afford whatever you charge. I just need someone I can trust, someone from Robert's family." Something in her tone made Michael pause. She didn't look like she could afford his fees. Her clothes were clean but clearly inexpensive, and her shoes had been resoled multiple times. But there was a quiet dignity about her that was hard to dismiss. "Mrs. Johnson, my standard consultation fee is $500, and any treatments or tests would be additional. If you're prepared for that level of expense, then we can proceed. But I want to be completely clear about the costs up front." To his surprise, she simply nodded and reached into her worn purse, pulling out a thick envelope. "Will cash be acceptable?" As Michael looked at the elderly woman sitting patiently before him, something shifted almost imperceptibly in his worldview. But his pride and the rigid boundaries he'd built around his practice still held firm. Whatever compassion his grandfather might have shown, Michael Thompson had built his success on very different principles, and he wasn't about to change them now. The afternoon would prove to be unlike any other in his carefully ordered professional life. Dr. Michael Thompson watched with barely concealed impatience as Margaret Johnson carefully counted out $500 in worn $20 bills. The sight of cash payments always made him uncomfortable. His wealthy clientele typically handled transactions through discreet billing arrangements with their accountants or business managers. The rustling of old bills seemed somehow unseemly in his pristine examination room. "This should cover the consultation," Margaret said softly, placing the money on the gleaming steel counter. "I apologize for not having an appointment. I know how busy you must be." Michael pocketed the cash quickly, eager to move past the awkwardness of the transaction. "Very well. What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Johnson?" As he began his examination, Margaret spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to not being listened to. "I've been having chest pains for the past few weeks, doctor. They come and go, but they're getting more frequent. Sometimes I feel dizzy, and my breathing gets difficult, especially when I climb stairs." Michael went through the motions of a basic examination, his stethoscope detecting an irregular heartbeat and what sounded like fluid in her lungs. Her blood pressure was elevated, and her pulse was weak and thready. Even with his cursory examination, the signs were pointing toward serious cardiac issues that would require immediate intervention and ongoing care. "Mrs. Johnson, you're showing signs of heart failure and possibly coronary artery disease. This requires immediate hospitalization and a full cardiac workup, echocardiogram, cardiac catheterization, possibly surgery. The treatment protocol alone could run into hundreds of thousands of dollars." Margaret's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "What are my options, doctor?" Michael felt the familiar weight of a decision he'd made countless times before. Cases like this were exactly why he'd moved away from general practice into exclusive concierge medicine. Cardiac patients required ongoing care, frequent monitoring, and substantial time investments that rarely translated into proportional compensation. More importantly, they often came with complicated family dynamics, insurance hassles, and emotional demands that disrupted the smooth efficiency of his practice. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to be frank with you. The level of care you need is beyond what I can provide in this practice. I specialize in preventive care and wellness optimization for a very specific clientele. What you need is a cardiologist with hospital privileges and a team that can provide around-the-clock monitoring." He moved to his computer and began typing, his fingers clicking efficiently across the keyboard. "I'm preparing a referral to Dr. Patricia Anderson at University Hospital. She's an excellent cardiologist who works with patients from all economic backgrounds. They have a charity care program that can help with costs." Margaret sat quietly for a moment, and Michael noticed her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her purse. "Doctor, I specifically sought you out because of your grandfather. He never turned anyone away, no matter how complicated their case, or how little they could pay. I was hoping—" "Mrs. Johnson," Michael interrupted, his tone becoming firmer, "my grandfather practiced 50 years ago. Medicine was different then, simpler, less specialized, less expensive. I've built this practice around providing premium care to patients who can afford premium fees. Taking on complex cases that require extensive resources isn't viable for a practice like mine." He printed out the referral and handed it to her, along with a business card for Dr. Anderson. "This is really the best option for you. University Hospital has state-of-the-art cardiac facilities and a full support team. You'll receive much better care there than anything I could provide." Margaret took the papers with a slight nod, but her eyes held a sadness that made Michael unexpectedly uncomfortable. "I understand, doctor. Thank you for your time." As she gathered her things slowly, Michael felt a strange compulsion to justify his decision further. "Mrs. Johnson, I want you to understand that this isn't personal. It's simply a matter of matching patients with the right level of care. My practice focuses on executive physicals, preventive medicine, and optimization protocols for high-functioning individuals. Cardiac emergencies require a different kind of medical infrastructure. Of course, Margaret replied quietly. I suppose I was naive to think that family traditions might still matter in medicine. The comment stung more than Michael cared to admit, but he maintained his professional composure. Medicine has evolved, Mrs. Johnson. We can provide better outcomes now by specializing and focusing our resources efficiently. As Jessica helped Margaret to the door, the elderly woman turned back one last time. Dr. Thompson, your grandfather once told me that the measure of a doctor isn't in the money he makes, but in the lives he touches. I hope someday you'll understand what he meant. After she left, Michael tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling her words had created. He had 3 more appointments that afternoon, each representing substantial revenue and the kind of straightforward medical interactions he preferred. Mr. Peterson needed his monthly testosterone optimization consultation. Mrs. Williams wanted to discuss the latest anti-aging treatments, and tech entrepreneur Sarah Chen was coming in for her quarterly performance enhancement evaluation. But as he reviewed his notes for Margaret's examination, the clinical details nagged at him. Her symptoms were classic signs of advanced heart failure, possibly brought on by years of untreated hypertension or underlying coronary disease. Without immediate intervention, she was looking at a rapid decline and potentially fatal complications within months, possibly weeks. He found himself wondering about her comment regarding his grandfather. How had she known Dr. Robert Thompson well enough to make such specific observations about his character? Michael's memories of his grandfather were fond but distant. Childhood visits to the small Illinois town where the older doctor had practiced, until well into his 70s, treating 3 generations of the same families. Jessica knocked on his door, interrupting his thoughts. Dr. Thompson, Mr. Peterson is here for his 3 o'clock appointment. Also, I wanted to mention Mrs. Johnson seemed very unsteady when she left. I offered to call her a taxi, but she said she'd take the bus. It just seemed, concerning. Michael felt another uncomfortable twinge. Taking the bus, in her condition, especially with the cardiac symptoms she was displaying, could be dangerous. But he'd made his decision, and, second-guessing himself now, would only complicate matters. I provided her with an excellent referral, Jessica. Dr. Anderson is one of the best cardiologists in the city. Mrs. Johnson will receive proper care. But as he prepared for his next appointment, Michael couldn't shake the image of Margaret Johnson sitting patiently in his waiting room for 3 hours, or the quiet dignity with which she'd accepted his dismissal. There had been something about her, a sense of depth and resilience that spoke of a life rich in experiences he couldn't begin to imagine. His grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his memory. Michael, every patient who walks through your door is someone's mother, father, child, or beloved friend. They're trusting you with the most precious thing they have, their health and their hope. Never forget that privilege. But Michael had built his success on different principles. He'd learned that emotional involvement led to poor business decisions, and that maintaining strict boundaries was essential for both professional efficiency and personal sanity. The medical school debt, the years of residency, the sacrifices to build his practice, all of that demanded a return on investment that charity cases simply couldn't provide. As Mr. Peterson settled into the examination room, discussing his latest marathon training regimen and optimal hormone levels, Michael forced himself to focus on the present. This was his world now, successful professionals who invested in their health the same way they invested in their portfolios. It was clean, efficient, and profitable, yet something had shifted in the atmosphere of his practice, as if Margaret Johnson had left behind an invisible question that refused to be dismissed as easily as she had been. The afternoon proceeded with its usual smooth efficiency, but Michael found his attention wandering at odd moments, wondering if she'd made it safely to University Hospital, if Dr. Anderson would see her quickly enough, if her condition was as serious as his examination had suggested. By evening, as he locked up his office and headed to his Mercedes in the underground parking garage, Michael had almost convinced himself that he'd handled the situation appropriately. But the image of Margaret Johnson's kind eyes and her quiet words about family traditions followed him home to his penthouse apartment, where he poured himself a glass of expensive wine and tried to forget the most unusual patient encounter of his career. He had no idea that this dismissal would prove to be the most costly decision of his professional life. 3 days after his encounter with Margaret Johnson, Dr. Michael Thompson was settling into his usual morning routine when his phone began ringing with unusual persistence. The first call came at 7:15 a.m. from Dr. Patricia Anderson at University Hospital, her voice tense and professional. "Michael, I need to ask you about a patient you referred to me, Margaret Johnson. She came to our emergency department yesterday in acute heart failure. We had to admit her immediately to the cardiac ICU." Michael set down his coffee cup, a knot forming in his stomach. "How is she doing?" "She's stable now, but it was touch and go for a while." "Michael, her condition was far more advanced than your referral indicated. She should have been hospitalized immediately when you saw her." "What made you think she could wait for a routine appointment?" The criticism in Patricia's voice was unmistakable, and Michael felt his defensive walls rising. "I provided what I thought was an appropriate referral based on my examination. My practice isn't equipped for acute cardiac emergencies." "That's not the point, Michael. You're trained to recognize medical emergencies, regardless of your practice model. This woman nearly died because she spent 2 days trying to get an appointment through our regular channels instead of going straight to the ER." After Patricia hung up, Michael sat in his pristine kitchen, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The accusation in her voice had hit him harder than he cared to admit. He was an excellent diagnostician. His medical school professors had praised his clinical instincts, and his residency supervisors had noted his ability to spot subtle signs. Others missed. Had he really failed to recognize the severity of Margaret's condition? Or had he simply chosen not to see it? The second call came an hour later from his medical school roommate, Dr. James Miller, now a prominent cardiologist in Boston. "Mike, I heard through the grapevine about Margaret Johnson. Patricia Anderson called me looking for background on her case. Do you realize who she is?" "An elderly woman with heart failure who couldn't afford proper care," Michael replied, though something in James's tone suggested there was more to the story. "Mike, Margaret Johnson is Margaret Johnson Williams. She's the widow of Robert Williams, the industrialist. She's worth about $800 million. The phone slipped from Michael's hand, clattering onto the marble counter. "What? I thought you knew. She's been in the news periodically over the years for her philanthropy. She donated the entire pediatric wing to Children's Hospital 5 years ago. She's funded scholarships for medical students, built clinics in underserved areas. Mike, she's one of the most generous benefactors in medical philanthropy in the Midwest." Michael's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. The woman who had sat patiently in his waiting room, counting out crumpled $20 bills, was worth $800 million? That's impossible. She was dressed like someone who doesn't need to impress. Anyone with expensive clothes? Mike. Margaret Johnson Williams has been known for decades for her simple lifestyle. Her husband died 15 years ago and left her one of the largest fortunes in the region. She spent most of it helping others. After James hung up, Michael sat in stunned silence. Images from their encounter flashed through his mind with new significance. The quiet dignity he'd noticed, the way she'd spoken about his grandfather. With such specific knowledge, the thick envelope of cash she'd produced without hesitation. She hadn't been a charity case seeking free care. She'd been testing him. The third call came that afternoon from his grandfather's former nurse, Betty Watson, now in her 80s and living in the same small Illinois town where Dr. Robert Thompson had practiced. Her voice was sharp with indignation. "Michael Thompson, I am ashamed to call you Robert's grandson. Margaret Johnson called me from the hospital to let me know how you treated her. That sweet woman spent 3 hours in your waiting room, and you turned her away like she was nobody." "Betty, I didn't know who she was." "That's exactly the problem. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. Your grandfather treated everyone with respect and compassion, whether they were the bank president or the janitor. Margaret Johnson was one of his favorite patients. He delivered her, took care of her through childhood illnesses, walked her down the aisle when her father couldn't because of his stroke." Michael felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "Why? Didn't she tell me any of this?" "Because she wanted to see what kind of doctor Robert's grandson had become. She told me she was hoping to find some trace of your grandfather's values in you. She was considering a major donation to establish a foundation in your grandfather's name, but after meeting you—" Betty's voice trailed off in disappointment. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine appointments, but Michael's mind was elsewhere. Between patients, he found himself researching Margaret Johnson Williams online, discovering a lifetime of quiet generosity that had touched thousands of lives. Photographs showed her at hospital openings, scholarship ceremonies, and community events, always dressed simply, always focused on others rather than herself. One article from 5 years earlier caught his attention. "Local philanthropist credits small-town doctor for inspiring lifetime of giving." The piece detailed how Margaret's relationship with Dr. Robert Thompson had shaped her understanding of service and compassion. "He taught me that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the lives you touch," she was quoted as saying. "He never had much materially, but he was the richest man I ever knew." By evening, Michael was consumed with an unfamiliar emotion, regret so profound it made his chest ache. He had built his entire career around avoiding exactly this kind of mistake, yet he had made the worst one possible. He had dismissed not just a patient in need, but a woman whose generosity could have transformed health care for thousands of people. Unable to sleep, he drove to University Hospital at nearly midnight using his professional credentials to gain access to the cardiac ICU. Margaret Johnson Williams lay in bed connected to monitors, her face peaceful in sleep but still bearing the pallor of serious illness. The steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft whoosh of oxygen provided a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. A night nurse approached quietly. "Are you family?" "No, I'm her doctor, the one who referred her." The nurse, a young woman named Sarah, looked at him with obvious disapproval. "She's been asking for you. She said she wanted to apologize for taking up your time." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Even from her hospital bed, fighting for her life, Margaret Johnson Williams was thinking of others, apologizing for inconveniencing the doctor who had turned her away. How is she doing? Better than yesterday, but Dr. Anderson says the damage to her heart is extensive. She'll need surgery, probably multiple procedures. She's been asking about establishing some kind of medical scholarship fund, even from her hospital bed. She says it's what Dr. Thompson, your grandfather, would have wanted. Michael stood at the foot of Margaret's bed, watching the monitors track her vital signs, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The ambition and financial success that had driven him for 15 years suddenly seemed hollow compared to the quiet dignity of the woman before him. He thought about his grandfather's old medical bag sitting dusty in his apartment closet, the same bag that had carried hope and healing to farm families and factory workers who had little money but infinite gratitude. He thought about the stories his grandfather had told about the privilege of being trusted with people's health, about the sacred responsibility that came with medical training. Margaret stirred in her sleep, and for a moment her eyes opened, focusing on Michael with surprising clarity. "Dr. Thompson," she whispered, "I'm sorry for the trouble I caused." "Mrs. Johnson Williams," he said softly, using her full name for the first time, "I'm the one who should apologize. I failed you, and I failed my grandfather's memory." A small smile crossed her face. "Your grandfather would be proud that you came." As she drifted back to sleep, Michael made a decision that would change the course of his life. The next morning, he would begin the process of transforming his practice, his priorities, and himself. But first, he had some very difficult phone calls to make, and some serious thinking to do about what it truly meant to be a doctor. The steady rhythm of Margaret's heart monitor seemed to echo his grandfather's voice. "Every patient who walks through your door is someone's mother, father, child, or beloved friend." This time, Michael was finally ready to listen. The morning after his late-night hospital visit, Dr. Michael Thompson sat in his office before dawn, staring at the awards and accolades that lined his walls, the golden plaques and framed certificates that had once filled him with pride now seemed to mock him with their empty recognition of professional achievement, divorced from human compassion. He had spent the sleepless hours researching everything he could find about Margaret Johnson Williams, and the depth of her generosity was staggering. Beyond the major donations that had made headlines, there were countless smaller acts of kindness, paying for medical students' textbooks, covering families' hospital bills, funding free clinics in rural communities, all done quietly, without fanfare or recognition. Jessica arrived at 8, surprised to find him already at his desk. "Dr. Thompson, you're here early. Your first appointment isn't until 9:30. Jessica, I need you to clear my schedule for the morning. I have some urgent matters to address." His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before, and she noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Is everything all right, doctor?" Michael looked at her for a long moment, this young woman who had worked for him for 3 years, efficiently, managing his appointments and politely turning away anyone who couldn't afford his fees. "Jessica, do you remember Mrs. Johnson from earlier this week? The elderly woman who waited for hours?" "Of course. I felt terrible about having to turn her away, but I know your policies. She's in the cardiac ICU at University Hospital. She nearly died because I refused to treat her properly." Jessica's face paled. "Oh my God. Is she going to be okay?" "I don't know. But I need you to understand something. She wasn't a charity case. Margaret Johnson Williams is worth $800 million. She's one of the most generous philanthropists in medical history, and I treated her like she was beneath my notice." The words hung in the air between them, and Michael saw his own shock and shame reflected in Jessica's expression. She had been following his instructions, maintaining the barriers he had erected, but the human cost of those policies was now undeniably clear. Michael's first call was to Dr. Patricia Anderson. Her voice was cool when she answered, and he didn't blame her. "Patricia, I need to know about Mrs. Johnson Williams's prognosis, and I need to ask what I can do to help with her care. She's stable but facing multiple surgeries. The damage to her heart is extensive. She's looking at valve replacement and possibly bypass surgery. But Michael, what she needs most isn't medical intervention at this point. She needs to see that not all doctors have forgotten why they went into medicine in the first place. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Patricia, I want to be involved in her care if she'll allow it, not as her primary physician, but as support. And I want to cover all her medical expenses." There was a long pause. "Michael, she doesn't need you to pay for her care. What she needs is for you to understand why she came to you in the first place." After hanging up, Michael sat staring at his appointment book, filled with the names of wealthy patients seeking enhancement rather than healing. Mr. Peterson wanting his monthly hormone optimization, Mrs. Rothschild discussing cosmetic procedures, tech executives looking for performance enhancement. When had healing the sick become so far removed from his practice of medicine? His second call was to his medical school dean, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, now in her 70s, but still sharp and commanding. She had been his mentor during his residency, and her opinion mattered more than almost anyone's. "Michael, I wondered when you'd call." Word travels fast in medical circles, especially when it involves someone as respected as Margaret Johnson Williams. "Dr. Harper, I made a terrible mistake. I let my business model override my medical judgment and my human decency." "Yes, you did. But the question now is what you plan to do about it." Margaret Johnson Williams has funded more medical scholarships than any individual donor in the state. She's built clinics, supported research, and helped thousands of students like you receive their education. And you dismissed her because she didn't fit your practice model. Michael felt each word like a physical blow. "I want to make it right. I want to change." Wanting to change and actually changing are two very different things, Michael. Your grandfather was one of the finest physicians I ever knew, and he'd be heartbroken to see what you've become. But he'd also believe in redemption if it came, from genuine transformation rather than guilt. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, Dr. Harper challenging Michael to examine not just his recent mistake, but the entire trajectory of his career. When had he stopped seeing patients as people and started seeing them as revenue sources? When had his grandfather's values become obstacles to overcome rather than principles to uphold? By afternoon, Michael had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He called an emergency meeting with his practice's financial advisor, his lawyer, and his office manager. The conference room that had hosted countless discussions about profit margins and expansion strategies now became the site of a different kind of planning session. "I want to restructure the entire practice," Michael announced, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "I want to establish a foundation that provides free medical care to anyone who needs it, funded by a percentage of all revenues from paying patients." His financial advisor, Robert Chen, nearly choked on his coffee. "Michael, that's financial suicide. Your overhead costs are enormous, and if you start taking charity cases, word will spread. Your paying clients will go elsewhere if they think they're subsidizing free care." "Then maybe those aren't the kind of clients I want," Michael replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Robert, I've been thinking about my grandfather's practice. He made house calls, treated anyone who needed help, and somehow managed to raise a family and live a good life. Maybe the problem isn't that compassionate medicine isn't profitable. Maybe the problem is that I've been defining profit too narrowly." His lawyer, Sandra Williams, looked equally concerned. "Michael, you have contractual obligations, malpractice insurance considerations, and licensing issues to think about. You can't just transform your entire practice model overnight. Then, help me figure out how to do it properly. I want to establish the Dr. Robert Thompson Foundation for Compassionate Care. I want to hire additional staff who share these values, and I want to start accepting Medicare and Medicaid patients alongside my private pay clientele." The meeting lasted 3 hours, filled with practical concerns and logistical challenges. But Michael found himself energized in a way he hadn't felt since his residency days. The problems they were discussing were real, but they were problems worth solving. That evening, he returned to the hospital to check on Margaret Johnson Williams. She was awake this time, sitting up in bed and looking remarkably alert despite her condition. Her simple hospital gown and wire-rimmed reading glasses gave her a scholarly appearance that reminded him strongly of his grandfather. "Mrs. Johnson Williams, I owe you a profound apology." She set aside the book she'd been reading, a biography of Albert Schweitzer, he noticed, and smiled with genuine warmth. "Dr. Thompson, please call me Margaret, and you don't owe me an apology. You provided exactly the care your practice model called for." "That's the problem. My practice model was wrong. My priorities were wrong. My grandfather would be ashamed of what I've become." Margaret studied his face carefully, and Michael had the sense she was seeing something that hadn't been there during their first meeting. Your grandfather talked about you often in his later years. He was so proud when you got into medical school, so hopeful about the kind of doctor you'd become. I've disappointed those hopes. Have you? Or are you just beginning to fulfill them?" She gestured to a chair beside her bed. "Tell me, what made you become a doctor in the first place?" Michael sat down, and for the first time in years, he found himself thinking not about business plans or revenue streams, but about the young man who had entered medical school with dreams of healing and helping. "I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to help people who were suffering." "And you still can," Margaret said softly. "It's never too late to remember why you started this journey." As they talked through the evening, Margaret shared stories of his grandfather that Michael had never heard. The night Dr. Robert Thompson had delivered her daughter during a blizzard, hiking 3 miles through snow when his car got stuck. The way he had sat with her husband during his final illness, providing comfort as much as medicine. The countless small acts of kindness that had rippled through their community for generations. "Your grandfather once told me that every patient teaches you something," Margaret said as visiting hours drew to a close. "Some teach you about medicine, some about compassion, and some about the kind of person you want to be. What have I taught you, Michael?" Michael considered the question seriously. "You've taught me that wealth and worth aren't the same thing. You've taught me that dignity doesn't depend on expensive clothes or prestigious addresses, and you've taught me that I've been practicing medicine with my hands and my mind, but not with my heart." Margaret smiled, and for the first time since their initial meeting, Michael saw approval in her eyes. "Your grandfather would be very proud to hear you say that." As Michael left the hospital that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success. The transformation ahead would be difficult, potentially costly, and certainly challenging. But for the first time in his career, he was excited about going to work not because of what he might earn, but because of whom he might help. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after Margaret Johnson Williams' hospitalization, Dr. Michael Thompson stood before the staff of Thompson Medical Center, preparing to announce changes that would fundamentally alter everything they had built together. The conference room was filled with employees who had helped create the most profitable medical practice in downtown Chicago, and he was about to tell them he wanted to give much of that profit away. Jessica Martinez sat in the front row, having already heard hints of what was coming. Beside her were the 3 nurses, 2 physician assistants, the office manager, and the billing specialist who had perfected the art of maximizing revenue from their wealthy clientele. These were good people who had followed his lead in creating a practice that prioritized financial success above all else. "I know this meeting is unusual," Michael began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. "But I need to share something with all of you that will affect our future direction." He told them about Margaret Johnson Williams, about his mistake, and about the soul-searching that had followed. As he spoke, he watched their faces reflect, a mixture of surprise, concern, and curiosity. "I'm proposing that we transform Thompson Medical Center into a dual-model practice," he continued. "We'll continue serving our existing clientele, but we'll also establish the Dr. Robert Thompson Foundation for Compassionate Care, providing free medical services to anyone who needs them, regardless of their ability to pay." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, his office manager, Patricia Lee, raised her hand tentatively. "Dr. Thompson, how would we fund something like that? The overhead costs alone. 30% of all revenue from paying patients will go into the foundation. We'll also be applying for grants and seeking additional donors. I know it sounds impossible, but I've been working with financial consultants, and it's viable if we're smart about implementation." Dr. Sarah Kim, one of his physician assistants, spoke up. "What about our existing patients? Won't they be uncomfortable sharing waiting rooms with charity cases?" The phrase charity cases hit Michael like a slap, partly because he heard his own former attitude reflected in it. "Sarah, That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to change. These won't be charity cases. They'll be patients who deserve the same respect and quality care as everyone else. We'll be serving the community that supported my grandfather for 40 years. Over the next hour, Michael outlined his vision. They would renovate the lower floor of the building to create a community clinic space. They would hire additional staff trained in treating diverse populations. Most importantly, they would train everyone to treat each patient with equal dignity, regardless of their insurance status or ability to pay. The questions came fast and concerned. What about malpractice insurance for treating higher-risk populations? How would they handle language barriers? What if word spread and they were overwhelmed with demand? Michael answered as best he could, but he could see the fear in their eyes, fear of change, fear of failure, fear of losing the comfortable predictability they had built together. After the meeting, Jessica lingered behind. "Dr. Thompson, can I speak honestly?" "Please do." "I think what you want to do is admirable, but I'm scared. This practice has been my whole career. I've got student loans, rent, car payments. What if this doesn't work? What if we lose everything?" Michael looked at this young woman who had been unfailingly loyal, who had followed his instructions to turn away patients like Margaret Johnson Williams, because that's what he had trained her to do. "Jessica, I can't promise this will be easy, but I can promise it will be meaningful, and I can promise that no one will lose their job because we're trying to do the right thing." The next morning brought Michael's first test case. At 8 a.m. sharp, a young Hispanic woman arrived with twin toddlers, both running fevers and crying inconsolably. She approached Jessica's desk hesitantly, speaking in accented English. "Please, I need doctor for my babies. They very sick." Jessica looked up at Michael, who had been watching from his office doorway. This was the moment of truth. Would they turn her away, as they had countless others, or would they begin implementing the changes he had announced? "What are their symptoms?" Michael asked, approaching the desk. The woman, who introduced herself as Maria Rodriguez, explained that the twins had been fevering for 2 days, wouldn't eat, and seemed to be getting worse. She worked as a housekeeper and had no insurance, but she was desperate for help. Michael knelt down to examine the children right there in the waiting area, noting the telltale rash and other symptoms that suggested scarlet fever, highly contagious and potentially dangerous if untreated, but easily curable with antibiotics. "Jessica, please set up examination room 2 immediately. Maria, we're going to take very good care of your children." As he worked, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the pure satisfaction of medicine practiced for its own sake. The twins had classic cases of strep throat that had progressed to scarlet fever, easily diagnosed and readily treatable. Within an hour, he had prescribed antibiotics, provided fever reducers, and given Maria detailed instructions for home care. "How much?" Maria asked anxiously, clutching her purse. "There's no charge," Michael replied. "But I want you to bring them back in 3 days to make sure they're improving." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "No charge? But, Senor Doctor, this beautiful place, you must—" "Maria, the only payment I want is for you to take good care of these children and bring them back, if you're worried about anything." Word of Michael's new policy spread quickly through the immigrant community that worked in the downtown area. By the end of the week, he had treated a construction worker with a badly infected cut, an elderly man with uncontrolled diabetes, and a pregnant teenager who hadn't seen a doctor in months. Each case reminded him why he had become a physician in the first place. The construction worker, Antonio Morales, had been ignoring his wound for weeks because he couldn't afford treatment, risking sepsis that could have killed him. The elderly man, George Washington, his parents had named him hopefully, had been rationing his insulin because of cost, slowly poisoning himself, rather than seeking help he thought he couldn't afford. But it was the pregnant teenager, 16-year-old Ashley Brown, who most reminded Michael of the stakes involved in health care access. She was 5 months pregnant, had received no prenatal care, and was terrified to tell her parents, about the pregnancy. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and she showed early signs of preeclampsia that could have killed both her and her baby. "Ashley, we need to get you to the hospital immediately," Michael explained gently. "You have a condition that's very treatable, but only if we catch it in time." "I can't pay for the hospital," she whispered. "I work part-time at a fast food place, and I don't have insurance. Let me worry about that. Right now, we need to focus on keeping you and your baby healthy." As Michael arranged Ashley's hospital admission and called in favors to ensure she received proper care, he thought about Margaret Johnson Williams, still recovering from her own heart surgery. She had been right to test him, right to look for some trace of his grandfather's values. The question was whether he could sustain this transformation when the real challenges began. Those challenges came sooner than expected. By the end of his second week of free care, Michael had treated 37 patients who couldn't pay. His paying clients were beginning to notice the changes, the longer wait times, the different demographic in the waiting room, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the practice's atmosphere. Mrs. Rothschild was the first to complain directly. "Michael, I'm concerned about the direction this practice is taking. When I pay premium fees, I expect a premium environment. Having sick children crying in the waiting room is hardly conducive to the peaceful experience I'm accustomed to." Michael felt his old instincts rising, the urge to apologize, to prioritize the paying customer, to maintain the artificial barriers that had defined his practice for so long. But instead, he found himself thinking of Maria Rodriguez's tears, of gratitude, of Ashley Brown's relief at finally receiving proper care, of his grandfather's voice reminding him why doctors exist in the first place. "Mrs. Rothschild, I understand your concerns, but I think you might find that being part of a practice that serves the entire community actually enhances rather than diminishes the experience. We're not just treating symptoms anymore, we're healing our community." She was not convinced, and Michael suspected he would lose some clients as word spread about his new direction. But as he locked up the office that evening and drove to check on Margaret Johnson Williams at the hospital, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the bone-deep satisfaction of work that mattered. Margaret was sitting up in her hospital bed, looking considerably better than she had 2 weeks earlier. Her color was good, and her breathing seemed much easier. "Michael, I hear you've been busy," she said with a knowing smile. "Word travels fast." "In the medical community, yes. I've had calls from 3 different doctors telling me about the changes at Thompson Medical Center. Dr. Anderson is particularly impressed. She says you personally coordinated care for a pregnant teenager who might have died without intervention." Michael sat down in his usual chair beside her bed. "Margaret, I want to ask you something. That first day you came to my office, did you know exactly what kind of doctor I had become?" She was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I had heard things. Your grandfather's friends in the medical community kept track of your career. They were proud of your success, but concerned about your priorities. So you were testing me. I was hoping to find some trace of Robert Thompson's grandson, and I'm happy to say that I think I have." Margaret reached for her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "Michael, I want to show you something. I've been working on this while recovering." Inside the envelope were architectural drawings, legal documents, and financial projections. As Michael studied them, his eyes widened in amazement. "This is a proposal for the Dr. Robert Thompson Center for Community Health," Margaret explained. "A $20 million facility that would serve as a model for compassionate health care delivery. I was planning to build it somewhere as a memorial to your grandfather, but I've been thinking it might be better to expand your existing practice instead." Michael stared at the plans, showing a state-of-the-art medical facility designed specifically for serving diverse populations, multilingual signage, family-friendly spaces, integrated social services, and everything needed to provide comprehensive care regardless of ability to pay. "Margaret, this is incredible, but I can't accept You're not accepting it, Michael. You're earning it. But only if you can prove that your transformation is genuine and lasting. I've seen too many people make grand gestures after being embarrassed, only to revert to old patterns when the attention dies down. She handed him a formal document. This is a provisional agreement. If you can successfully operate your dual model practice for 1 full year, demonstrating both sustainable finances and genuine commitment to serving all patients equally, the foundation will fund this expansion. But if you revert to your old ways, the offer disappears. As Michael drove home that night, the plans and agreement on his passenger seat, he felt the weight of both opportunity and responsibility. He had 1 year to prove that his grandfather's values could coexist with modern medical practice. 1 year to demonstrate that compassionate care was not just idealistic, but practical and sustainable. The real test was just beginning. But for the first time in his career, Michael Thompson was eager to face it. 6 weeks into his practice transformation, Dr. Michael Thompson arrived at his office to find a line of patients stretching down the hallway and into the building's lobby. Word had spread through Chicago's underserved communities about the doctor, who provided free care without judgment, and the demand was overwhelming his carefully planned capacity. Jessica Martinez looked frazzled as she tried to manage the crowd. "Dr. Thompson, we have 43 people waiting, and more keep arriving. I've told them we can only see emergencies today, but everyone says their case is urgent." Michael surveyed the scene, elderly immigrants clutching prescription bottles, young mothers with sick children, construction workers with obvious injuries, and teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. This was exactly what his financial advisor had warned him about: unlimited demand, meeting limited resources. "Let me speak to them," Michael said, stepping into the crowded waiting area. The conversations died down as he addressed the group in English, with Jessica translating into Spanish. "I know you've all been waiting, and I'm sorry for the delays. We're still learning how to manage this new system, but I want you to know that everyone will be seen. Those with urgent medical needs will be taken first, and others may need to schedule appointments for later in the week." An elderly man raised his hand. "Doctor, my diabetes medicine ran out 3 days ago." "Is that urgent enough?" A young woman, holding a toddler, spoke up. "My baby has been coughing for a week and didn't sleep last night." Michael realized that everything seemed urgent when you had no access to regular health care. These people had been rationing medical attention for so long that minor problems had become major ones through neglect. Everyone with diabetes medication, issues, or sick children under 5, please move to the right side of the room. We'll see you first. Everyone else, Jessica will help you schedule appointments this week. The sorting process took another hour, but it revealed something important. Most of these cases were preventable complications of untreated conditions. The diabetes medication crisis could have been avoided with regular checkups and prescriptions management. The sick children mostly had minor infections that had worsened due to delayed treatment. Dr. Sarah Kim, his physician assistant, pulled him aside between patients. "Michael, we're seeing the same problems we'd expect at a county emergency room, but we don't have county emergency room resources. That construction worker with the infected hand, he needs IV antibiotics and possibly surgery. The elderly woman with chest pains, she needs a cardiac workup we can't provide here." Michael was beginning to understand the complexity of serving underserved populations. It wasn't just about providing free care. It was about addressing years of delayed treatment, coordinating with specialists who might not accept charity cases, and managing conditions that required resources beyond what a private practice could provide. His lunch break was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Dr. Patricia Anderson from University's Hospital. "Michael, we need to talk. You've sent me 6 patients in the past 2 weeks, all requiring immediate hospitalization. I'm happy to help, but we need to coordinate better. These people need seamless care, not medical ping-pong." Patricia was right. Michael had been so focused on the idealistic goal of providing free care that he hadn't fully considered the practical challenges of care's coordination for complex cases. What do you suggest? Partnership. University Hospital has a community outreach program that's been underfunded for years. If your foundation could help support it, we could create a formal referral system with guaranteed access to specialists and hospital services for your uninsured patients. The idea was brilliant, but would require resources Michael hadn't anticipated. His 30% revenue allocation was already stretched thin by the increased patient volume and longer appointment times. Adding hospital partnership costs would push his finances to the breaking point. That afternoon brought another challenge in the form of State Medical Board investigator Linda Chen, who arrived unannounced with a clipboard and serious expression. Dr. Thompson, we've received several complaints about changes in your practice model. Some patients have expressed concerns about care quality and wait times. We need to conduct a compliance review. Michael's heart sank. He had been so focused on the humanitarian aspects of his transformation that he hadn't considered the regulatory implications. Medical boards were notoriously conservative, and dramatic practice changes often triggered investigations. What specific concerns have been raised? Allegations that you're providing substandard care to non-paying patients, that your office is overcrowded and unsanitary, and that you're operating outside your scope of practice by treating conditions that require specialist care. Michael knew exactly who had filed these complaints, several of his former high-end clients who had been unhappy with the changes. Mrs. Rothschild had made good on her threat to take her business elsewhere, but apparently not before trying to sabotage his new direction. The investigation took 3 hours. Linda Chen interviewed staff, reviewed patient records, and examined facilities. To Michael's relief, she found no evidence of substandard care or unsafe conditions. In fact, she seemed impressed by the quality of record-keeping and the obvious dedication of the staff. Dr. Thompson, your patient outcomes are actually better than average, and your safety protocols exceed requirements. However, I do have concerns about sustainability. You're seeing triple your previous patient volume with the same staffing levels. That's a recipe for burnout and potential errors. After she left, Michael sat in his office feeling overwhelmed. The noble goal of compassionate health care was running headlong into practical realities: insufficient resources, regulatory scrutiny, staff exhaustion, and financial strain. Jessica knocked on his door with another challenge. Dr. Thompson, Mr. Peterson called to cancel his testosterone optimization appointments. He said he's found a practice that focuses on successful professionals rather than social work. He's the third paying client to leave this month. Michael did the math quickly in his head. Each defecting wealthy client reduced the revenue available to subsidize free care. If the trend continued, the foundation would collapse within months. That evening, he drove to University Hospital to visit Margaret Johnson Williams, who was finally preparing for discharge after her heart surgery. She looked remarkably well, her color good and her energy obviously returning. You look troubled, Michael. He described the challenges of the past few weeks, the overwhelming demand, the resource constraints, the regulatory scrutiny, and the defecting clients. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding with understanding. "Are you having second thoughts about this transformation?" she asked when he finished. "I'm starting to understand why most doctors avoid this path. It's not just about wanting to help people, it's about having the resources and systems to help them effectively." Margaret smiled. "Your grandfather faced similar challenges when he started practicing. The difference was that he began with modest expectations and grew gradually. You're trying to transform an entire practice model overnight." She was right. Michael had approached compassionate care the same way he'd approached building his luxury. Practice with grand gestures and dramatic changes rather than thoughtful, sustainable development. What would you suggest? Start smaller. Focus on doing a few things very well, rather than trying to help everyone immediately. Build partnerships, like the one Patricia Anderson suggested, and most importantly, don't lose sight of why you started this journey. As if summoned by their conversation, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Johnson-Williams, there's a young woman here asking to see you. She says Dr. Thompson treated her baby, and she wanted to thank you both." Maria Rodriguez entered shyly, carrying one of her twin toddlers. The child looked completely healthy, bright eyes, good color, and the kind of energy that indicated full recovery. "Senora Margaret," Maria said, having heard somehow that Margaret was the benefactor behind Michael's free care program. "Dr. Thompson saved my babies. They were so sick and I had no money, but he helped them anyway," she turned to Michael. "Dr. Miguel and Sophia are completely well now. I brought this for you." She handed him a carefully wrapped package containing homemade tamales. "My grandmother's recipe. It's all I have to give, but I wanted you to know how grateful we are." After Maria left, Margaret and Michael sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Michael, that woman has 6 children. She works 3 jobs and still can't afford health care for her family. But she took time to make you tamales and bring her healthy child to show you the results of your work. That's the real measure of success in medicine." Michael looked at the package of tamales, worth maybe $5 in ingredients, but representing hours of work from a woman who had very little time to spare. It was a far cry from the expensive wines and luxury gifts his wealthy clients had occasionally given him, but it carried infinitely more meaning. "You're right, Margaret. I've been so focused on the big picture that I've lost sight of individual victories like Miguel and Sofia Rodriguez." "The big picture matters too," Margaret replied, "but it's built one patient at a time, one family at a time, one life changed at a time. Your grandfather understood that." As Michael prepared to leave, Margaret handed him another envelope. "These are the contact information for 3 other physicians who've successfully built sustainable practices serving diverse populations. Study what they've done, learn from their mistakes, and remember, you don't have to save the world in your first year." Driving home through the Chicago evening, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose tempered by realistic understanding of the challenges ahead. The transformation would be harder than he'd imagined, but the rewards, measured in lives touched rather than dollars earned, would be infinitely more meaningful. The real work was just beginning, but he finally understood that sustainable change required patience, planning, and partnerships rather than dramatic gestures. Margaret Johnson-Williams had given him more than money. She had given him the wisdom to build something lasting. 3 months into his practice transformation, Dr. Michael Thompson stood before the Chicago Medical Society's monthly meeting, addressing a room full of colleagues who regarded his recent changes with mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He had been invited to speak about innovative practice models in urban healthcare, but he suspected most attendees were there to witness what they expected to be his professional downfall. "6 months ago, I ran what you'd probably call a typical concierge medicine practice," Michael began, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. "High fees, exclusive clientele, maximum profit margins. I thought I was practicing medicine at its finest. I was wrong." A murmur rippled through the audience. Dr. James Harrison, Michael's former medical school classmate, who now ran a similar worse high-end practice, raised his eyebrows skeptically. Michael continued telling the story of Margaret Johnson-Williams and his subsequent awakening, but focusing on the practical lessons he'd learned about sustainable healthcare delivery. He shared data about patient outcomes, financial models, and community impact, making the case that compassionate care could be both ethically right and economically viable. The key insight, he explained, is that serving underserved populations actually makes you a better doctor for all your patients, When you treat diabetes in a construction worker who's been rationing insulin, you gain insights that help you provide better preventive care for your executive patients. When you deliver a baby for a teenage mother with no prenatal care, you develop skills that benefit all your obstetric cases. Dr. Patricia Anderson, who had been working closely with Michael's foundation, stood to support his presentation. I can confirm that Dr. Thompson's patients, both paying and non-paying, show excellent outcomes. More importantly, his model is reducing emergency room overcrowding by providing consistent primary care to populations that previously only sought help in crisis situations. The questions that followed were pointed but fair. How did he manage the financial pressures? What about malpractice liability with higher-risk populations? How did he maintain quality control with increased patient volume? Michael answered honestly, acknowledging the challenges while sharing specific solutions he'd developed. The revenue-sharing model that funded free care through a percentage of paying patient fees. The partnership with University Hospital that provided seamless access to specialty services. The team-based care approach that allowed him to see more patients without compromising quality. After the presentation, several colleagues approached him privately. Dr. Susan Martinez, who ran a family practice in a predominantly Latino neighborhood, was particularly interested. Michael, I've been trying to make something like this work for years, but I can't get the economics right. Would you be willing to share your financial models? More than willing. What if we formed a consortium of practices committed to this approach? We could share resources, coordinate referrals, and learn from each other's successes and failures. The idea energized Michael in a way he hadn't expected. Instead of competing with other physicians for wealthy clients, they could collaborate to improve healthcare access for everyone. By the end of the evening, 5 doctors had committed to exploring this consortium model. Meanwhile, back at Thompson Medical Center, the day-to-day challenges of dual model practice continued to evolve. Jessica Martinez had grown into her expanded role, developing systems for managing complex scheduling and becoming fluent in basic medical Spanish. The nursing staff had adapted to treating everything from executive physicals to childhood immunizations, often within the same hour. Dr. Sarah Kim had initially been skeptical of the changes, but she was becoming one of Michael's strongest advocates. I went to medical school to help people, she confided during a lunch break. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that meant all people, not just those who could afford premium care. The practice was beginning to attract attention from unexpected quarters. A reporter from Chicago Tribune had called, requesting an interview about innovative healthcare delivery models. Medical students from 3 different schools had inquired about rotation opportunities. Most surprisingly, 2 other physicians had approached Michael about joining the practice. Dr. Lisa Chen was a recent residency graduate who had turned down lucrative offers from established practices to work for Michael's foundation. Her fluency in Mandarin and Cantonese opened doors to serving Chicago's Chinese community, many of whom had been avoiding medical care due to language barriers and cultural misunderstandings. Dr. Robert Williams, a semi-retired internist in his 60s, offered to volunteer his services 2 days per week. I've been looking for a way to give back, he explained. Your grandfather's reputation inspired me to become a doctor 40 years ago. I'd like to help carry on his legacy. With expanded staffing came expanded capacity, and Michael began to see the vision Margaret Johnson Williams had outlined taking concrete shape. They were no longer just providing crisis intervention for underserved populations. They were offering comprehensive primary care that could prevent problems before they became emergencies. The success stories were accumulating. Ashley Brown, the pregnant teenager Michael had treated months earlier, had delivered a healthy baby girl and was now in college while her mother helped with child care. George Washington, the elderly diabetic, had achieved excellent blood sugar control and lost 30 pounds. Maria Rodriguez's twins were thriving, and Maria herself had become an informal ambassador for the practice, referring neighbors and friends who needed care. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in Michael himself. He found himself looking forward to work in ways he hadn't experienced since residency. Each day brought new challenges, but they were challenges that mattered, helping a recent immigrant navigate the healthcare system, coordinating care for a homeless veteran with multiple health issues, teaching a teenager about sexual health and contraception. The financial pressures remained real but manageable. Michael had learned to live on significantly less income than his previous lifestyle had demanded, discovering that expensive wines and luxury cars mattered far less than meaningful work. The practice was covering its costs and generating enough surplus to fund the free care program, though there was little left over for the kind of aggressive expansion he might once have pursued. Margaret Johnson Williams, now fully recovered from her heart surgery, had become a regular presence at the practice. She often sat in the waiting room, observing the interactions between staff and patients, occasionally offering quiet suggestions for improvements. Her trained eye for systems and organization proved invaluable in refining their operations. "You're beginning to understand what your grandfather knew instinctively," she told Michael one afternoon, as they watched a busy but well-organized waiting room filled with patients from across the economic spectrum. "Good medicine isn't about the fanciest equipment or the most exclusive clientele. It's about competent, compassionate care delivered consistently to everyone who needs it." Michael had been tracking outcomes carefully, partly to satisfy his own curiosity and partly to prepare for the year-end evaluation that would determine Margaret's major expansion funding. The data was encouraging. Patient satisfaction scores were higher than during his concierge-only period, clinical outcomes were excellent across all demographic groups, and staff turnover was virtually non-existent despite the increased workload. More importantly, the practice was beginning to influence the surrounding community in ways Michael hadn't anticipated. Local businesses were referring employees for care. Schools were asking for health education programs. Community leaders were seeking partnerships for wellness initiatives. "We're not just treating individual patients anymore," Dr. Lisa Chen observed during a staff meeting. "We're becoming part of the community health infrastructure." The observation struck Michael as profoundly accurate. His grandfather's small-town practice had served a similar function, not just providing medical care, but serving as a trusted resource for health information, a coordinator of community wellness, and a bridge between medical expertise and community needs. As the 6th month of his transformation approached, Michael felt cautiously optimistic about the year-end evaluation that would determine Margaret's expansion funding. More importantly, he felt certain that regardless of the outcome, he had found his calling as a physician. The work was harder than his previous practice model, the income was lower, and the challenges were more complex. But the satisfaction was deeper and more lasting than anything he had experienced in his pursuit of wealth and prestige. The boy who had been inspired by his grandfather's stories of healing and helping had finally become the man his grandfather had hoped he would be. The question now was whether he could sustain and expand this model to benefit even more people in need of compassionate, accessible health care. The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a direction he never could have anticipated. As Dr. Michael Thompson's practice transformation approached its 10th month, a crisis emerged that would test every principle he had embraced and every system he had built. It began with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. on a cold February morning. "Dr. Thompson, this is Elena Rodriguez at University Hospital Emergency Department. We have a situation involving several of your patients." Michael sat up immediately, his heart racing. "What kind of situation?" "There was an apartment fire in the Pilsen neighborhood about 2 hours ago. 17 families have been displaced, and we have multiple patients with smoke inhalation, burns, and trauma. The problem is, most of them are undocumented and afraid to give their real names or addresses, but they keep asking for you specifically. Within 30 minutes, Michael was at the hospital, still wearing the clothes he'd thrown on over his pajamas. The emergency department was controlled chaos, medical staff moving efficiently between patients, while social workers tried to coordinate housing and support services for families who had lost everything. He recognized faces immediately. The Morales family from apartment 2B, whose youngest daughter he'd been treating for asthma. Mrs. Chen and her elderly father, whom he'd helped manage diabetes and high blood pressure. The young mother with twins whose names he remembered were Isabella and Carlos, not the Miguel and Sofia she'd told him months ago, probably afraid of deportation, even when seeking medical care. Dr. Patricia Anderson pulled him aside. "Michael, we've got good news and bad news. The good news is that no one died, and the injuries are mostly treatable. The bad news is that 17 families are now homeless. Most have no insurance, and they're terrified of being reported to immigration authorities if they access social services." Michael surveyed the scene, families huddled together in hospital gowns and borrowed clothes, children crying from fear and confusion, adults speaking in worried whispers about what would happen next. These weren't just patients anymore. They were people he'd come to know personally, families whose stories he'd heard during routine checkups, children whose growth he'd been monitoring month by month. What do they need immediately? Medical care is covered. We can handle the emergency treatment, but they need housing, clothing, food, and ongoing care for the smoke inhalation and minor burns. Most importantly, they need to know they're safe from deportation while they recover. Michael made a decision that would have been unthinkable during his concierge medicine days. "Bring them all to my practice. We'll set up temporary housing in our community room and examination areas. It's not ideal, but it's safe and warm, and they trust us." Dr. Anderson stared at him. "Michael, that's admirable, but you don't have facilities for overnight patients, let alone families with children. The medical board would have serious concerns about scope of practice. Then we'll make it work within regulations. We'll coordinate with social services, but we'll be their advocates and their safe harbor until permanent solutions are found." By dawn, Thompson Medical Center had been transformed into an informal refugee center. Examination rooms became family sleeping areas. The waiting room was filled with donated clothing and toys. The staff break room had become a temporary kitchen serving donated food prepared by other families from the neighborhood who had heard about the fire. Jessica Martinez had arrived at 5 a.m. with her arms full of supplies and her teenage daughter. In tow to help with translations, Dr. Sarah Kim canceled her morning appointments to help coordinate care. Even Dr. Robert Williams, the volunteer physician, had driven in from the suburbs with medical supplies and equipment. The challenges were immediate and complex. 7-year-old Carmen Morales was having severe asthma complications from smoke inhalation. Mr. Chen's diabetes medications had been destroyed in the fire, and his blood sugar was dangerously elevated. The infant twins needed specialized formula that their mother couldn't afford to replace. But the more difficult challenges were social and legal. Mrs. Rodriguez, he now learned her real name was Elena Vasquez, confided that she had been in the country illegally for 12 years, working multiple jobs to support her family while avoiding any interaction with authorities. Several other families faced similar situations, making them reluctant to apply for Red Cross assistance or temporary housing programs. Michael found himself serving roles far beyond his medical training, coordinating with immigration attorneys, negotiating with landlords, and advocating with social service agencies. It was exhausting and frustrating work, but it was also exactly what his grandfather would have done. Margaret Johnson Williams appeared at the practice at noon, having heard about the fire on the news. She surveyed the controlled chaos with an expression that was part concern and part admiration. "Michael, this is either the most beautiful thing I've seen in healthcare or the most dangerous mistake you could make for your career. I'm hoping it's the former." Margaret moved through the makeshift refugee center, speaking quietly with families, helping organize supplies, and observing how Michael and his staff were managing the crisis. She watched him examine children on examination tables that had been converted to beds, coordinate prescription deliveries for patients whose medications had been destroyed, and call in favors from colleagues to expedite specialist consultations. Later that afternoon, the Chicago Department of Health arrived for an unscheduled inspection. Michael's heart sank as he recognized the inspector, Dr. David Chen, known throughout the medical community for his strict interpretation of regulations and his skepticism toward unconventional practice models. "Dr. Thompson, we've received reports that you're housing non-patients in a medical facility, providing services outside your scope of practice, and operating without proper licensing for shelter activities." Michael met the inspector at the entrance, very aware that 17 families were depending on his ability to navigate this conversation successfully. "Dr. Chen, we're providing emergency medical care to patients who were displaced by fire. All services are within our scope of practice, and we're coordinating with appropriate social service agencies for non-medical needs." The inspection lasted 2 hours. Dr. Chen examined every room, interviewed staff members, and reviewed medical records. Michael held his breath as the inspector documented potential violations and questioned the appropriateness of using medical facilities for social services. Finally, Dr. Chen approached Michael with his findings. "Dr. Thompson, technically you're in violation of several regulations regarding facility usage and patient housing. However, I'm also aware that these families would otherwise be sleeping in their cars or in overcrowded shelters where their medical needs couldn't be properly monitored." He paused, looking around at the scene, children playing quietly while their parents received medical care, elderly patients getting their medications adjusted, families beginning to hope that their situation might be temporary rather than permanently devastating. "I'm going to document this as emergency medical care provision under crisis circumstances, but you need to transition these families to appropriate housing within 72 hours. And you need formal agreements with social service agencies to cover the non-medical aspects of their care." After Dr. Chen left, Michael slumped against the reception desk, exhausted by the stress of the day. Margaret approached with 2 cups of coffee and a slight smile. "You realize what just happened, don't you? I almost lost my license for good." "Intentions? You passed the most important test possible. When faced with a choice between regulations and compassion, you chose compassion first and then found ways to satisfy regulations. That's exactly what your grandfather would have done." Over the next 3 days, Michael coordinated an intricate dance of services and support to transition the fire victims to permanent solutions. 2 families moved in temporarily with relatives. 3 families found apartment rentals through a coalition of local churches that Margaret had quietly mobilized. The remaining families were placed in transitional housing provided by the Red Cross, with Michael's practice serving as their ongoing medical home. The crisis had revealed something important about the practice's evolution. They were no longer just providing individual medical care. They had become a trusted community institution that people turned to in times of crisis. More importantly, they had demonstrated the ability to respond effectively to complex challenges that required both medical expertise and social coordination. But the real test came 2 weeks later, when Michael received an unexpected visit from Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the dean of his medical school. She arrived without appointment or fanfare, simply appearing in his waiting room on a Tuesday afternoon like any other patient. "Elizabeth, what brings you here?" "I wanted to see for myself what you've built, Michael. The medical community is buzzing with stories about your transformation. But stories can be misleading. I needed to observe firsthand." Dr. Harper spent the entire afternoon at the practice, observing patient interactions, reviewing protocols, and speaking privately with staff members. She watched Michael treat a corporate executive's hypertension in one room, then immediately moved to another room to examine a homeless veteran's infected wound. She noted how seamlessly the staff switched between languages, how naturally they adapted their communication style to different cultural contexts, and how consistently they treated every patient with respect, regardless of their circumstances. Michael: I need to ask you directly, are you providing different levels of care based on patients' ability to pay? The question was pointed and necessary. Medical ethics demanded that all patients receive appropriate care regardless of their financial status, but human nature and economic pressures sometimes created subtle disparities. "Come with me," Michael replied, leading her to his office, where he pulled up patient outcome data on his computer. Every patient receives the same clinical protocols, the same diagnostic workups when indicated, and the same follow-up care. The only difference is how we bill. The data was compelling. Clinical outcomes were consistent across all demographic and economic groups. Patient satisfaction scores were high across all populations. Most tellingly, his referral patterns to specialists showed no correlation with patient income. He sent people for advanced care based solely on medical need. Dr. Harper studied the information carefully, her expression revealing nothing. Finally, she spoke. "Michael, I've reviewed hundreds of practice models over my career. What you've created here is remarkable, not because it's unprecedented. Your grandfather and doctors like him practiced this way for generations, but because you've proven it can work in modern medicine's complex environment." She paused, looking out at the waiting room where a tech entrepreneur sat next to a day laborer's wife, both waiting patiently for their appointments. "But I need to warn you about something. Success like this attracts attention, and not all of that attention will be positive. There are forces in healthcare, insurance companies, hospital corporations, medical device manufacturers that profit from the current system. Your model threatens those profits." As if summoned by her warning, Michael's phone rang with a call from his malpractice insurance carrier. The conversation was brief but troubling. His premiums were being increased by 40% due to his expanded patient demographics and increased case complexity. Similar pressures began mounting from other directions. His medical supply company questioned his increased usage patterns. His electronic medical records vendor suggested he might need a higher-tier service package to handle his patient volume. Even his building's management company raised concerns about increased foot traffic and demographic changes. Each challenge was manageable individually, but collectively they represented a systematic effort to make his practice model financially unsustainable. Michael realized that Dr. Harper had been absolutely right. His success was threatening to established interests that preferred the status quo. The pressure intensified when 3 of his remaining high-end clients received anonymous letters suggesting they seek care from more exclusive practices that maintain traditional standards. While the letters never directly mentioned race or class, their implications were clear and disturbing. Michael called an emergency meeting with Margaret Johnson Williams, Dr. Patricia Anderson, and his legal advisor. The situation required strategic thinking beyond his medical expertise. "This is predictable," Margaret observed calmly. "Any time someone challenges existing power structures, those structures push back. Your grandfather faced similar pressures when he refused to charge different fees based on patients' race or social status. What did he do? He built alliances. He found other physicians who shared his values, hospital administrators who believed in community service, and community leaders who supported equitable health care. Most importantly, he documented everything meticulously so that when challenges came, he could prove his practice was both ethical and effective." Dr. Anderson nodded. "Margaret's right. But you also have advantages your grandfather didn't have. You have data proving your model works, legal protections against discrimination, and a community that's witnessed your impact firsthand. The legal advisor, Sandra Williams, was more cautious. Michael, you need to understand that this pressure campaign will likely escalate. You should prepare for formal complaints to medical boards, insurance investigations, and possibly even federal scrutiny if someone claims you're violating billing regulations by providing free care. Instead of intimidating Michael, these warnings crystallized his resolve. The transformation had begun as an attempt to redeem a personal failure, but it had evolved into something larger, a demonstration that healthcare could be both compassionate and professional, both profitable and accessible. That evening, he sat in Margaret Johnson Williams's hospital room. She was back for routine follow-up tests, and shared his growing understanding of what they were really attempting. Margaret, we're not just running a medical practice anymore. We're challenging the assumption that good health care has to be exclusive, or that serving everyone means compromising quality. Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had finally grasped an important lesson. Now you understand why I tested you so thoroughly. I wasn't just looking for a doctor who would treat poor patients. There are plenty of those in community health centers. I was looking for someone who could prove that the artificial barriers between premium and charity medicine are just that, artificial. She reached for her purse and pulled out a familiar envelope. Your year isn't up yet, but I've seen enough. The architectural plans I showed you months ago, construction begins next week. The Dr. Robert Thompson Center for Community Health will be built adjacent to your current practice, providing 20 examination rooms, 3 minor surgery suites, and full diagnostic capabilities. Michael stared at the construction timeline, hardly believing what he was seeing. Margaret, this is incredible, but the pressure campaign will fail, she interrupted firmly, because you'll have the resources to withstand it and the results to prove your critics wrong. More importantly, you'll have something they don't, the trust and support of the community you serve. As Michael drove home that night, he felt the weight of both opportunity and responsibility. The coming months would test not just his medical skills, but his character, his resilience, and his commitment to principles that went beyond personal success. But for the first time since his transformation began, he felt truly ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had found his purpose, built his team, and proven his model. Now it was time to show the medical community and the world that his grandfather's values weren't just nostalgic ideals, but practical principles for healing both patients and communities. The real battle was just beginning, but Michael Thompson finally understood that it was a battle worth fighting. The construction of the Dr. Robert Thompson Center for Community Health had been underway for 3 months when Dr. Michael Thompson received a phone call that would change everything he thought he knew about his transformation journey. The caller was attorney William Peterson, representing the estate of Margaret Johnson Williams. Michael's hands trembled as he held the phone. I don't understand. Margaret is fine. I had lunch with her yesterday. Dr. Thompson, I'm afraid there's been a terrible accident. Mrs. Johnson Williams was struck by a car while crossing the street near the construction site this morning. She's in critical condition at University Hospital. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur. Michael found himself in the familiar cardiac ICU, where he had first truly encountered Margaret's wisdom and generosity. But now she was the patient, connected to the same monitors and machines that had sustained her during her heart surgery the year before. Dr. Patricia Anderson met him at the doorway. Michael, I'm so sorry. She has severe head trauma and internal bleeding. We've stabilized her for now, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael sat beside Margaret's bed, watching the steady rhythm of the ventilator and remembering all the conversations they'd shared in this same room. Her face was peaceful despite the tubes and monitors, and he found himself holding her hand and talking to her as if she could hear every word. Margaret, you can't leave now. We're just getting started. The center is almost finished, and we're helping more people than ever. I need your wisdom, your guidance, your belief that this matters." Hours passed. Michael refused to leave, sending Jessica to cover his appointments and coordinating patient care by phone when necessary. Colleagues came and went. Dr. Anderson, checking constantly, nurses providing gentle updates, other physicians from the community stopping by to pay their respects to a woman who had touched so many lives. As evening approached, Attorney Peterson returned with a briefcase and a solemn expression. "Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Johnson-Williams insisted I speak with you if anything ever happened to her. She left very specific instructions." Michael looked up from Margaret's bedside. "What kind of instructions?" "She wanted you to understand the full scope of what she's been planning. The medical center construction is just the beginning. She's established a $50 million endowment for community health care initiatives, with you named as the primary director." The number was so large that Michael couldn't immediately process it. $50 million? There's more. She's purchased the entire city block surrounding your practice, with plans for affordable housing integrated with health care services. She's also funded scholarships for medical students who commit to practicing community-based medicine. And she's established partnership agreements with 5 other cities to replicate your model. Peterson opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. But perhaps most importantly, she's left you a letter that explains why she chose you for this responsibility. Michael's hand shook as he opened the envelope bearing his name in Margaret's careful handwriting. "My dear Michael, if you're reading this, something has happened to me before I could complete our conversation about the future. I need you to understand that everything, from my first visit to your practice to the construction of the medical center, has been part of a larger plan to restore your grandfather's vision of medicine to the modern world. You see, I didn't just know your grandfather. Professionally, I was in love with him." Michael stopped reading, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes. He looked at Margaret's still form and tried to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about her. "We met when I was 22, shortly after my first husband died in Korea. Your grandfather was 35, recently widowed himself, and the kindest man I had ever known. We spent 2 years quietly courting, planning a future together that would combine his medical mission with my financial resources. But then he met your grandmother, and I could see immediately that he loved her in a way he could never love me. Being the man he was, he came to me honestly, explaining his feelings and apologizing for the pain he knew it would cause. I told him then what I'm telling you now, that love sometimes means wanting someone's happiness, even when it doesn't include you. Your grandfather and I remained friends for 50 years, but I never married again. Instead, I channeled all the love I would have given him into supporting the causes he cared about: health care for the underserved, medical education, and the belief that every person deserves compassionate care, regardless of their circumstances. When I heard about your successful but soulless practice, I knew I had found my purpose at last. I would test whether Robert's grandson had inherited any trace of his character, and if so, I would provide the resources to help you build something worthy of his memory. You passed every test, Michael, even ones you didn't know you were taking. You changed not just your practice model, but your heart. You learned to see patients as people rather than profit centers. You discovered that medicine's highest calling isn't wealth or prestige, but service and healing. Now I'm trusting you with more than money. I'm trusting you with a dream your grandfather and I shared 50 years ago. Build the kind of healthcare system we believed was possible, comprehensive, compassionate, and accessible to all. Show the world that medical excellence and social justice aren't competing values, but complementary ones. The endowment will provide resources, but the real work must come from you and others who share this vision. Train the next generation of physicians to value compassion alongside competence. Create systems that reward healing rather than just billing. And never forget that every patient who trusts you with their care is someone's beloved child, parent, or sibling. Your grandfather used to say that the measure of a life isn't in the wealth accumulated, but in the love shared and the good accomplished. I pray that you'll live by those words as he did, and as I have tried to do, with all my love and faith in your future, Margaret P.S. In my desk drawer at home, you'll find your grandfather's original medical bag and his patient journals from 40 years of practice. Study them. They contain wisdom that no medical school can teach. Michael finished reading the letter through tears that he made no effort to hide. Attorney Peterson waited respectfully before speaking again. Dr. Thompson, there's one more thing. Mrs. Johnson Williams recorded a video message for the medical center's dedication ceremony. She wanted to make sure her intentions were clear to everyone who would benefit from her gift. As they sat in the ICU discussing the practical details of Margaret's bequest, Michael felt the weight of a legacy far greater than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about building a medical practice or even a healthcare center. It was about honoring a love story that had shaped 2 lives and would now impact thousands more. Dr. Anderson appeared in the doorway with an update. Michael, she's stable, but the next 24 hours will be critical. The brain swelling isn't responding. As well as we'd hoped. Michael nodded, understanding the subtext. Margaret Johnson Williams, the woman who had transformed his life and was now entrusting him with her life's work, might not survive to see the fruits of her generosity. He spent that night in the chair beside her bed, alternately reading her letter and talking to her unconscious form about his plans for the endowment, his gratitude for her guidance, and his promise to honor both her memory and his grandfather's legacy. As dawn broke over Chicago, Margaret's eyes fluttered open briefly. She looked at Michael with perfect clarity and whispered, "Take care of our patients, dear." Those were her last words. Margaret Johnson Williams died peacefully at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, surrounded by the steady beeping of monitors and the presence of a young doctor who had learned to see healing as a calling rather than a career. The funeral 3 days later filled the largest church in Chicago with patients, physicians, medical students, and community leaders gathering to honor a woman whose generosity had touched thousands of lives. Michael delivered the eulogy, sharing Margaret's story and her vision for the future of healthcare. Margaret Johnson Williams taught me that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in lives improved, that success isn't defined by profit margins, but by problems solved, and that the highest calling in medicine isn't serving the wealthy, but serving everyone with equal compassion and skill. He paused, looking out at the congregation filled with faces representing every economic level and ethnic background, testament to Margaret's belief that healthcare should unite rather than divide. Communities. She's entrusted us with resources to build something extraordinary, but more importantly, she's challenged us to become the kinds of healers our profession was always meant to produce. The question now isn't whether we'll honor her memory, but how we'll exceed even her ambitious dreams for what healthcare can become. As Michael stood beside Margaret's grave after the service, he thought about the journey that had begun with his arrogant dismissal of a poorly dressed elderly woman and was now continuing with a $50 million mandate to transform healthcare delivery. The responsibility was daunting, but the purpose was clear. Margaret Johnson Williams had given him more than money. She had given him the chance to complete a love story that had begun 50 years earlier between a small-town doctor and a wealthy young woman who both understood that true healing goes far beyond medical treatment to encompass the full spectrum of human caring. The Dr. Robert Thompson Center for Community Health would open in 2 months, but Michael now understood that the real memorial to Margaret's love and his grandfather's values would be built one patient at a time, one family at a time, one life transformed at a time. The work was just beginning, but for the first time since this journey started, Michael felt truly ready for whatever lay ahead. 6 months after Margaret Johnson Williams's death, Dr. Michael Thompson stood before the gleaming entrance of the Dr. Robert Thompson Center for Community Health, watching as the final dedication ceremony preparations were completed. The building's modern design seamlessly integrated with his original practice, creating a comprehensive healthcare campus that could serve thousands of patients annually while maintaining the personal touch that had defined his grandfather's approach to medicine. The dedication ceremony had drawn a remarkable crowd. Medical professionals from across the country had come to see what many were calling a revolutionary model for healthcare delivery. Community leaders, former patients, and medical students filled the temporary seating area, while news crews documented what was being described as the largest single donation to community health care in Chicago's history. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, now serving as chairman of the center's advisory board, approached the podium to introduce the day's program. "We gather today to celebrate more than just a building," she began. "We celebrate a vision of medicine that puts healing ahead of profit, compassion ahead of convenience, and community service ahead of personal enrichment." The morning's speakers included Dr. Patricia Anderson, who had helped coordinate the seamless integration between the center and University Hospital's specialist services, Dr. Susan Martinez, whose own practice had joined Michael's consortium and was now serving as a model for community-based care, and representatives from 5 other cities, where similar centers were being planned using Margaret's endowment funds. But the most moving presentation came from Maria Rodriguez, now Elena Vasquez, having felt safe enough to use her real name, who spoke on behalf of the patients whose lives had been transformed by Michael's journey from exclusivity to inclusivity. "Dr. Thompson saved my babies when I thought I had nowhere to turn," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But more than that, he showed me that good people exist who care about families like mine. This center will help thousands of other families who need to know they matter, that their health matters, that their children's futures matter." As the formal ceremony concluded and tours of the new facility began, Michael found himself in the memorial garden that had been planted in Margaret's honor. The space featured medicinal plants and healing herbs from around the world, surrounding a simple bench bearing a plaque with Margaret's words, "The measure of a life isn't in the wealth accumulated, but in the love shared and the good accomplished. Jessica." Martinez, now the center's administrative director, approached with a tablet showing the day's statistics. "Dr. Thompson, we have registration forms from over 300 new patients, including families from 7 different countries. The pharmacy has filled 43 prescriptions at no charge, and Dr. Chen's Mandarin language clinic is booked solid for the next month." Michael smiled, remembering his former obsession with very different kinds of numbers, profit margins, and fee schedules, rather than lives touched and barriers removed. "Any word from the State Medical Board about our final licensing approval? Approved this morning with commendations for innovative practice design and community integration." Dr. Chen from the Health Department specifically mentioned that our model should be studied by other practices looking to serve diverse populations. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors touring the facility. Medical students asked detailed questions about the financial sustainability of providing free care alongside fee-for-service medicine. Hospital administrators inquired about the partnership models that allowed seamless referral to specialty services. Insurance executives, initially skeptical, were surprised to learn that the center's patients showed better outcomes and lower emergency room usage than comparable populations. Dr. Lisa Chen, now the center's medical director, conducted a group of visiting physicians through the pediatric wing. The key insight is that providing comprehensive primary care actually reduces overall health care costs, she explained. When children receive regular checkups, immunizations, and early treatment for minor illnesses, they don't end up in emergency rooms with preventable complications. The most sophisticated aspect of the center was its integrated approach to social determinants of health. Beyond medical care, the facility included a social worker, a nutritionist, legal aid services for immigration and insurance issues, and educational programs addressing everything from diabetes management to prenatal care. We learned that you can't treat hypertension effectively if patients can't afford their medications, can't read the instructions, or are too stressed about deportation to keep their appointments, Dr. Kim explained to a group of medical school deans. So we address all those barriers as part of comprehensive care. As evening approached, Michael made his way to his original office, now part of the expanded complex, but still featuring the same desk where he had once dismissed Margaret Johnson Williams as unworthy of his attention. On that desk now sat his grandfather's medical bag, carefully restored, and the patient journals Margaret had mentioned in her letter. He had spent countless hours reading those journals, discovering the depth of his grandfather's commitment to each patient's well-being. The entries revealed not just medical treatments, but follow-up visits to check on families facing economic hardship, coordination with local churches to provide food for hungry children, and advocacy with employers to ensure injured workers received proper compensation. One entry, dated 53 years earlier, particularly resonated, saw Margaret Johnson today for her pre-wedding physical. Such a remarkable young woman, intelligent, generous, with a heart for service, that reminds me why I became a doctor. She'll make some fortunate man very happy and do tremendous good in the world. I pray her wealth never corrupts her compassion, as money has corrupted so many who started with good intentions. Michael had read that entry dozens of times, marveling at his grandfather's prescient understanding of both Margaret's character and the challenges facing physicians who achieved financial success. The old doctor had somehow foreseen that his grandson would need to choose between wealth and compassion, and had left guideposts for making the right choice. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Robert Williams, the semi-retired internist, who had become one of the center's most beloved volunteer physicians, appeared in the doorway. "Michael, I wanted you to see something before I left today." He handed over a handwritten note from Ashley Brown, the pregnant teenager Michael had treated during his early days of transformation. "Dear Dr. Thompson and Dr. Williams, I graduated from nursing school today. I wanted you to know that everything started when you took care of me and my baby when we needed help most. Emma is now 3 years old and perfectly healthy. I'm starting work at University Hospital next month, and I hope to specialize in prenatal care for underserved populations. Thank you for showing me that health care can be about more than just business." With gratitude, Ashley Brown, RN Michael felt tears forming as he read Ashley's words. This was the true measure of success, not just healing immediate problems, but inspiring others to carry the mission forward to the next generation. "Robert, do you think my grandfather would be proud of what we've built here?" The older physician smiled. "Michael, your grandfather would be amazed. He treated individual patients with love and dedication, but he never could have imagined a raw, systematic approach to community health care like this. You've taken his values and created something that can help thousands of people while training the next generation of physicians to practice with both competence and compassion." As the last visitors departed and the staff completed their closing routines, Michael walked through the quiet hallways of the center. Each room represented Margaret's vision made tangible, examination rooms equipped with state-of-the-art technology, but designed to feel welcoming rather than intimidating. Waiting areas that accommodated families with children and elderly patients with mobility challenges, and signage in 6 languages reflecting the diversity of the community they served. In the main lobby, Margaret's recorded message played on a loop for visitors. Healthcare is a human right, not a luxury service. Every person who enters these doors, regardless of their ability to pay, their immigration status, or their social position, deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and clinical excellence. The physicians and staff who work here have committed themselves to something higher than personal profit. They have committed to healing our community, one patient at a time. Michael paused to listen to Margaret's voice, still missing her wisdom and guidance, but feeling her presence in every aspect of the center's operation. She had orchestrated his transformation with the patience of someone who understood that lasting change requires both external pressure and internal growth. The statistics at the end of the center's first full day of operation told an impressive story. 127 patients seen, 31 prescriptions provided at no cost, 8 referrals to specialty care, 3 patients enrolled in health insurance programs they hadn't known existed, and 1 baby delivered in the new obstetrics suite by Dr. Kim, with the proud father weeping tears of joy as he held his American-born daughter. But the real story wasn't in numbers, it was in the transformation of healthcare from a transactional service to a community institution. Patients came not just when they were sick, but for wellness visits, health education, and preventive care. Families brought their children for immunizations and stayed to attend parenting classes. Elderly patients arrived for medical appointments and remained for social activities that addressed the isolation and loneliness that often contributed to poor health outcomes. As Michael locked the center's doors that first evening, he thought about the journey that had brought him from arrogant dismissal of a poorly dressed elderly woman to serving as director of one of the most innovative healthcare facilities in the country. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had been profoundly meaningful. His cell phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. "Dr. Thompson, Channel 7 wants to interview you about the center for tomorrow's morning show. They're calling. It, the doctor who chose people over profit. Should I schedule it?" Michael smiled, remembering his former hunger for media attention and professional accolades. Those motivations seemed hollow compared to the satisfaction of work that mattered. But if publicity could help other physicians understand that compassionate care was both possible and profitable, then perhaps it served a worthwhile purpose. He texted back, "Schedule it, but make sure they understand this isn't about one doctor's transformation. It's about proving that healthcare can serve everyone excellently when we choose community over commerce." As Michael drove home through the Chicago streets, he passed the modest apartment building where Maria Rodriguez and her twins now lived in subsidized housing, the construction site where Antonio Morales worked with proper safety equipment and health insurance, and the high school where Ashley Brown had once feared telling her parents about her pregnancy, and now served as a volunteer mentor for other young mothers. Each of these lives had been touched by Margaret Johnson Williams's generous vision and his grandfather's enduring values. But more importantly, each represented proof that individual transformation could ripple outward to heal entire communities. The Dr. Robert Thompson Center for Community Health would serve thousands of patients in the years ahead, train hundreds of medical students in compassionate care, and inspire similar centers in cities across the country. But its greatest achievement would be demonstrating that the artificial barriers between premium and charity medicine could be dissolved, replaced by a health care system that served everyone with equal skill, respect, and dedication. Michaels pulled into his modest apartment complex. He had sold his penthouse and expensive car to help fund the center's operations and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with luxury or status. He was finally the doctor his grandfather had hoped he would become, the physician Margaret had believed he could be, and the healer his patients deserved. The work would continue tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows ahead, but tonight he could rest in the knowledge that love, compassion, and dedication had triumphed over greed, arrogance, and exclusion. Margaret Johnson Williams had kept her promise to honor his grandfather's memory, and Michael Thompson had kept his promise to honor hers. The circle of healing was complete, but its influence would continue expanding for generations to come, touching lives not yet born and inspiring healers not yet trained, all because one elderly woman had tested one arrogant doctor and found in him the spark of his grandfather's compassionate heart. In healthcare, as in life, love ultimately conquers.